Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Once again, this is premiering on Saturday. I had a busy week this week, but that's aside the point. Into the news. Now, I'm going to round up some news that we left off last week because it was still developing, and that is, let's just say, a certain doctor who is science, okay? His own words. He is science. One, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Again, don't let the appearance, don't let the voice fool you. He's definitely just a proud Italian American, not anything else. Okay, let's just get that out of the way first. Now, it looks like he had the Hillary Clinton experience. It looks like his emails got leaked. Now, they've done a very good job memory holding this. Nobody's talking about it even more. Even like a lot of the conspiratard people aren't talking about it anymore. Not that, again, not that like his emails getting leaked or the stuff in them is fake or fabricated, but the people like the conclusions they try to draw from the show that this means Trump will be back in office in August. Again, the Kopanon crowd, even they've shut up about this. They've moved on to something else. But point being is, it confirmed a lot of suspicions that this was played up. That this, of course, whole situation. You have stuff from March of 2020, which is stuff he was saying publicly, mind you, like, oh yeah, these masks don't work. A lot of these precautions, they're just bunk. We're just doing it for appearances and because this can be advantageous to us. And here's a way we can turn this against the regime. And really, I didn't go through much of them, but just talking about them conceptually, I think put a lot of what we and a lot of people in our spheres were saying at the beginning of this because when this first started in late January, early February of last year, I was thinking, you were thinking, you can go back and listen to our shows from that time, that, wow, this could be the straw that breaks the world order's camel's back. This could be the final just bit of pressure needed on the neoliberal system for something new to arise from it, for this global empire to crumble. And honestly, at that way, with the way a lot of the corporations panicking, with the way a lot of Western governments were panicking, it did sincerely look like that this was something that would be a massive destabilization to the liberal world order, which I did welcome to a degree, especially considering the fact how much, like, again, everyone across the political spectrum, from Chuck Schumer to Nancy Pelosi to Donald Trump, and then you go into Europe, from Merkel to Boris Johnson before he did a complete 180 to Macron, were saying, oh no, this is no big deal. Go enjoy Chinatown. Trust me, there's nothing wrong with this. It's all going to be fine. It's not even a real thing. It's, just don't worry about it. And then, of
The
course,
flu.
come yeah, it's just the flu. Then come March, April 2020, it's you have to get serious about this. We're going to be locked down indefinitely. We need to get a vaccine ASAP. You got to wear your masks, and then of course you got a double mask, triple mask, etc. So again, they do that complete 180, which in my opinion is where like a lot of the skepticism for the masks and the lockdowns came from because. On the surface, I think a lot of us, including myself, supported these at first thing. Oh, yeah, it's not that big of a deal. We can do that for a few weeks, 6 weeks, whatever, until this thing blows over. But I think to the normal person, especially like the normal conservative, who's already sort of distrustful of the government, and not for bad reasons, mind you, saw them just vehemently denying this thing, the media not talking about it, trying to cover it up, and then all of a sudden doing a 180 saying this, this, and this, I could see how that leads to distrust. Like, why should I believe you that these masks work? Why should I believe you that these lockdowns work, etc., etc.? And at the end of the day, I think these people had a point. I think they saw an opportunity, and again, not even getting into the lab leak stuff, which has been just sort of assumed from the beginning that this research lab. Now, whether it was released intentionally, unintentionally, who knows? I don't think it was some grand plot from the Chinese Communist Party. Again, not that they aren't looking to take us down a peg, admittedly. Again, it is a global rivalry. Just shy of a Cold War. We're trending toward that direction as time goes on, but again, I don't think Xi Jinping and the CCP elites were sitting around thinking of this elaborate plan. I think they probably had more conventional ways of confronting the United States. Now, I think they were the biggest beneficiary of this. I think they played their card right to come up way on top of this. I think China ultimately did win the day. And although the neoliberal order, just to give a retrospective of this entire debacle, although the neoliberal world order was able to re-entrench itself probably for another few good decades using this sort of thing, turning this into their new sort of civic religion, one of many, of course, that the other including LGBTQ, CIA, sexual liberation, all this kind of stuff. It's a pantheon of civic beliefs, if you will. And of course,
Hmm.
mask wearing and vaccinations is being the new one, more so the vaccinations nowadays. But with all that being said, it did re-entrench them, but like, how much juice can you squeeze out of the system? Really, how much is left? Sure, this may have buoyed you above the water, but you're gonna sink sooner or later. Just looking at the direction of this empire, and you can look at a lot of things, especially with the um, racial tensions last summer, with the riots and the protests and all that kind of stuff, and just the last presidential election cycle, and really the global standing of the United States. I would say since 2018, maybe 2019 if we want to be generous, but in the minds of most people, 2020 and 2021. People can't look at this and say that we really came out on top. Yeah, sure, the regime was able to re entrench itself internally, as I said, but in terms of actually maintaining the power it had, say, even Trump's first couple of years or Obama's last few years, that bridge has long been crossed. We are long crossed that bridge. That bridge has not only been crossed, but it like they severed little bridge cables after it, so nobody else can cross it. It's we're at that level. As bad of an analogy as that is, but getting to my ultimate point is like, yeah, sure, it bought them some time, but how much? I think it bought them maybe a decade or two at most, and that was my initial prediction. I would say a decade at most. Maybe it got them 5 extra years of hegemony, but even internally and externally, their regime seems to be falling apart. And again, people wonder about these Fauci emails. People wonder how could this happen, and honestly, with him and with the Bill Gates divorce thing and a lot of the stuff coming out, especially after Bill Gates' divorce with Epstein, and then you talk about Epstein, you get into, you go back even further, like 2017, 2018, you talk about Weinstein, Me Too. Where I think we've been seeing a trend of since 2017, since Trump had that initial destabilization of the regime, at least on a wide scale, that the higher up elites, many of whom we probably don't know who they are, a few we probably do, are willing to sacrifice the lower level elites, so to speak, so that as people like Dr. Fauci or quote unquote Dr. Fauci, or Bill Gates or Jeffrey Epstein or Harvey Weinstein, or name any of these people who've been embroiled in any of these kind of scandals. And again, I think these are the ones that are set aside to appease it, and of course take care of the internal rivalries that exist within the elite. Especially when you want to get into the calling way back when the Harvey Weinstein case. Like, yeah, he let's just say he pissed off another powerful member of his group, and that's why he is in prison today. Now, again, that's not even getting to the allegations and the charges against him. I'm not even going to wade through that. That was like a year ago at this point, even longer. But point being is the only reason those charges stuck as genuine or as trumped up as they were is because he pissed off the wrong guy who was more powerful than him. And you're seeing this trend go on, and I think you'll continue to see this trend where it's sort of a placation for these Copenhagen type people or these people who are dissidents of the regime when they see a powerful person fall like Epstein, like Weinstein, like Bill Gates, or name any of these other figures, or and it makes them feel like, oh wow, we're doing something, we're winning this time. When it's really just these people who are disposable, these people who are the I again who are just like these mid-ranking people in the system, mid-ranking to low-ranking people in the system, that could be easily replaced by just about anyone who has a few $1 million or a few tens of $1 million. And I do think we'll continue to see this trend as time goes on and on. They'll just keep uh, feeding this to the population. They'll just keep giving them just this little bit here, like, oh look, there's hope. Oh look, the storm is coming. Or isn't that what the Copenhagen people used to say? The storm is coming, like back in 2018. But they'll keep feeding people this kind of stuff to make them think, oh, something is actually changing, while hiding the real change, which is the regime is completely falling apart. But they'll placate you in thinking that, oh, hey, X, Y, and Z figure got arrested. And again, I think Matt Gaetz, who was some congressman who was more on the like Trumpian side, also had charges against him, and he had to resign from Congress. But I think you'll see trends of this sort of things with relatively powerful people, but not extremely powerful people, being thrown to the wolves time and time again as the years go on, as the regime starts to lose less, as the regime starts to lose its grip on more and more of the population. And I think this will be the operating procedure going forward, which we've seen since again 2017.
I mean, in my opinion, okay, I will say that, after Biden canceled the investigation that Trump had started into the origins of the COVID virus, it seemed like a done deal. But when Biden's attitude towards China had not changed, and it was obvious that Biden was only going to continue what Trump had started, then In that light, I would say it made sense that Biden reopened the investigation. Of course, there were already warning signs over a year ago that definitely there was a strong possibility that this virus could not have mutated to produce that particular protein horn, as it were, that acts to unlock cells. And this is goes on to explain why the virus is so much more contagious than, let's say, than the regular flu. Um, you know, that was ignored. Uh, the mask wearing, the effectiveness of the mask wearing was ignored. Even the strategy about how to deal with this was ignored because Fauci received, an email outlining, for instance, that with like 5,000 doctors and medical scientists saying this is only affecting, very old people, people with prior conditions like diabetes or obesity, and is has almost, unlike colds, has almost no effect on children at all. And that was ignored. Then he received another email um, uh, saying that China is lying about the actual figures. That was ignored. So he literally, for that one, he said it. You know what? It was too long. I didn't read it. That was literally his excuse. So the evidence of shoddy work on by Fauci was already there. But what hadn't changed is like America's struggle against China, and so it was inevitable that they would open up this case again, and Fauci had to be sacrificed. And Fauci is kind of like, for them, a kind of great figure to sacrifice because he's a man that wanted to be in the limelight. So, for instance, there was going to be a movie about Fauci, which has been canceled. His upcoming book has been canceled by Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and every other large American bookseller. So it's a disaster, right? But he's going to be jettisoned. The left will eventually, I think, adapt to it because they know their source of power derives from the inner party that is the Democrat Party. There might be a small struggle against it, but he's not worth it. Like, I think they will eventually abandon the almost godlike worship that they had around Fauci. He became something of a saintly figure.
You know who
You know,
this reminds me of?
mm.
Robert Mueller.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. Like, they all forgot about his phony testimony that led to the Iraq War, all the lies that he spewed to do that, because of course we have to stop Blumph. So they can be very single-minded when it comes to this. Any excuse will be used. That was then, this is now. Who cares? Blumph is more important. So Fauci was viewed the same way, that he was a man of science mauled by Trump's megalomania and his oafishness, right? So, but he has to be sacrificed because geopolitics takes precedence. It really just comes down to that. America is no further in stopping China than it was when Trump was in office, even though Trump got some of the major firms that produce computer chips, Samsung, and that one from Taiwan. It's the three letters. I always mess this up. But anyway,
GAY?
no, it's Taiwanese, and it's the largest producer. So I think it's like THS something. Anyhow, I can't remember it. So there's two plants that are opened up in the U.S. This was a $12 billion deal to get them to open up here. And so why? I mean, is Biden going to reverse that? No, he's not going to reverse that. He knows that if Taiwan is bought out, which is happening, many of these, to create these computer semiconductors, it's not easy, right? Like, it's a numbers game. In 2020, there were 20 of these companies. There are now only three. And Samsung does not produce like the majority that are used for computers and for laptops, right? They do more of the mobile stuff rather than, laptops and desktops. So, um, that was an important move. So you could see that geopolitically, Biden is not that different than Trump. Of course, what scared the system with Trump was the mythology of Trump. That Trump literally played a figure that may never come to America or that may come, but he was not that. He was not that figure, and particularly white people who feel like issues have been ignored and that they are being demonized. Um, they felt that they had a voice in him. And I think that that was the real threat. It wasn't so much the geopolitics. Um, you know, sanctions. Most of them are all there. This difference on JPCOA, yes, that's true. But in terms of Russia and China, mostly the same. With China, very much the same. The border issue is looking like it's the same based on, but we'll get into that later, based on Kamala Harris's words. So yeah, Fauci is expendable, and he has to be expended. And he's kind of a vain figure. And men who really want power are not that vain. They're not, especially like I would say with the fall of monarchies, men who want power in the what I would call the democratic oligarchical system know better to stay in the shadows and not go for a movie made after you. Or I mean, he's a man of science. Why do you want like a movie made after you? Like, this is a vain man, right?
Yeah, like he
And
doesn't have like the ruthless cutthroat nature that you'd expect of somebody seeking power, whether it be in the spotlight, for example, somebody running for president. I'd say so. People like the Clintons would probably follow in that example when you want to talk about elected figures, public officials, or again the shadowy figures who are bureaucrats, or again maybe like a pre-election George H.W. Bush would cover that. Somebody who is just cutthroat, somebody who is ruthless, remorseless, and they know when to shut up. They know not to make it all about them because that compromises their quote unquote plan, so to speak.
right, right. So he's kind of an expendable guy. He doesn't even have the prudence of a man that has been in very powerful circles in America for so many decades, has not figured out how this thing works, and foolishly and vainly decided to publicize his image even further. And so, um, as you see this week, more so than last week, they are going to continue to legitimize the lab theory as a very probable theory. They may not have a conclusive answer. Their conclusive answer, of course, only needs to be that there's a strong possibility it came from a lab, because patient zeros, the analysis of patient zeros showed that this virus could not have mutated to the extent that it had. Um, there's enough evidence to suggest that something was not quite right. Of course, we know that all big countries, all major powers, delve into bioweaponry. America has no less than 65 all across the Soviet zone, and that includes China. We know that there's cross investment between countries, even countries that are largely at odds with one another. I think with COVID, it was very uncertain at the start what it would do. China's reaction implies a certain amount of insider knowledge that this could be very bad. I think their reaction, I don't think that was all game. I don't think only 4,000 people died in Wuhan. So my guess is they prepared literally for the worst. because they knew some of the intimate details of what was happening there. Of course, meanwhile, the West was, essentially being more laissez-faire about it and, protecting the market. But it switched, of course. We know that. It switched. And, if Pelosi and Trump agree on too many things, then it's time to separate. And of course, what happened in the interim is that, they saw an opportunity. Inflation would be created, but at the same time, you would have huge consolidation. So America has 9 new billionaires. Uh, all kinds of small businesses are gone for good, even some medium-sized businesses. So I think they adapted to it very well. But as you say, they're kicking the can down the road, and eventually, this is going to be very problematic for, like, let's say, the average American.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I think that's what it's all been leading up to because a lot of these people have the ability to jump ship or fly off to their bunkers in Montana when things really start to fall apart. Your average American does not have that luxury. And just to briefly mention this, not to get too much into this, because I think this really warrants a segment, if not an episode of its own, on a later date where it's much better research, where you have investment firms like BlackRock buying up all these homes. And, of course, you have major conservative figures such as, of course, Ben Shapiro coming out and saying, well, it's not that big of a deal. Look, they're still getting in. What's the big deal if investment firms buy homes when you look at the average household debt of an American or just the average financial state of an American, I don't know, say under 40 or 45. And really, going back to Bill Gates buying up hundreds, if not thousands of acres of farmland.
Yeah,
That had to be about, what, 5, 6 months ago at this point? But point
yeah,
being is, you get all these things where conditions continue to get worse and worse for the average American when you have to realize, I'm not saying all regimes have historically cared about their people. Now I'm saying some certainly have more than others, but most have had the sense, the ones that don't drive themselves in the ground, the ones that have longevity, at least have the sense to quote unquote buy off their people. Give them just comfortable enough standard of living so they'll shut up and not rebel or not drop out of society. And at this point, again, you look at the statistics of young Americans, I would say people from like 35 and under or 40 and under or 45 and under, whatever standpoint you want to pick, and you compare them to their parents and their grandparents' generations, they're not moving out of home. They're not. They don't have the same sort of stable careers. They're not bringing the same kind of money. They haven't gotten married or started families yet. They aren't able to purchase homes just because of the current economic situations. Then you add on student debt, which I think student debt is a bit of a distraction issue in terms of, well, yes, of course, it's a problem. A lot of people do have student debt, but I think other kinds of debt, such as car debt, such as all these other things, are much bigger issues that are ensnaring your average American, especially even your average young American who maybe isn't college educated or is a college dropout, or maybe they got their degree but it turned out to be worthless and oversaturated. But point being is, you get this decline in conditions, and all of a sudden you get these investment firms and these elites buying up massive amounts of land, massive amounts of property, of real estate, just out of the blue. It makes you start to wonder what is really going on. And not to get into quote unquote great reset territory, because I think the rhetoric surrounding the great reset is ironically enough optimistic, implying most of the things they're talking about they haven't already done to us or aren't about to do to us. Because again, when people talk about the great reset, there's this implication that it's something that is on the horizon that can be stopped, when realistically they already have their boot on our necks. As I say this all the time, the only reason we can do this show is because we have such a small audience and we're ultimately relevant to the grand scheme of things. Now, I think this is a nice little cozy hangout where we can all get together and sort of discuss these issues. Don't get me wrong, I love it. But at the end of the day, my audience of 800 subscribers and you dozen or so people in the live chat, again, much appreciated. We're not going to be the ones who overthrow the regime or change the world in any significant way with these numbers and with this amount of influence, especially on a platform, again, like YouTube and mainstream social media. But with that out of the way, right there, again, you continue to see conditions decline, and really, I do have to wonder, and maybe you have insight on this, but I really want the perspective of people who lived through the collapse of, for example, the Eastern Bloc, where was the falling apart of society this subtle? Because it seems like most Americans, like, they have a sense that things aren't going to be good for the future, but they're not acting in a way that is according. Now, admittedly, I'm not, and I mean, I am a little. I won't give away too much what I'm doing, but compared to how urgent I think the situation is, I would say I'm certainly underreacting just because of my current circumstances in my personal life. But point being is, like, you talk to the average American, they're clearly not an optimistic for the future. They have little to no faith in the government, in the institutions, in the regime itself. But you're not seeing them do anything accordingly. You're not seeing them, make any plans for, like, oh, what happens when this all goes to hell? Because it seems like that's something that they know is going to happen, but they all think, well, I'm not going to be around for it, or it's not going to affect me. Yeah, sure, things are going to happen in DC, sure, things are going to happen around the world, but there's no way it's going to reverberate into Chicago or LA or wherever the hell I live, or, name any populated city, or even, small town people. And again, I am really curious if this mindset existed in other empires that were in decline or on the brink of collapse. Not that I'm saying we're on the brink of collapse, but I think we're definitely in a very steep decline. And I think probably the most poignant example, because there's people who are still alive for that and still coherent enough to speak about it, was the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm really curious is, like, in the '80s Soviet Union, did it feel this way, where people, like, knew something bad was on the horizon, but just continued to go on day by day?
From people I know who lived through it, I think for them, the authoritarianism is what stands out the most. Um, the lack of varied opinions, the media fawning over one political figure and demonizing another to build consensus. Those really stand out. You know, economically, there's too many parts of America where, like, there's no food shortage. It's not like, Thursdays and Sundays are meat days. It's not like that. And, some countries have been poor their whole lives, so that's the way they subsisted. You ate meat twice a week. That's what you could afford. Um, so I don't think there's not there isn't such a large portion of America that lives that way that you could pinpoint.
Fair, and
Uh,
I've made this point before, and on this show even, where realistically things are just in terrible condition, and there's like, you look at this empire, you look at the system, and think, how the hell is this still functioning? But then you realize that we're in a very awkward position where people aren't materially wealthy enough to advance their lives, but they're also too materially comfortable to throw their lives away in, for example, something like a revolt or dropping out of society or radically change their lives. See, they're at that perfect zone, perfect middle point of material wealth, where if they were any poorer, they would be a threat, or if they were any richer, they'd be a threat. And they want to keep you right there,
right, right.
just on that living paycheck by paycheck thing. They don't want you to have a savings, but they also don't want you to be so poor that you're on the streets and have nothing to lose by, committing, for example, a federal crime, or participating in a quote unquote insurrection, despite the horrible, horrible one we had in Capitol Hill at the beginning of the year. Don't get me wrong, but with all that being said, again, it's they have you in that trap, and they want you in that area where you're just rich enough to keep your head enough above the water, but not to actually make anything out of your lives. Again, pretty much they want you as the wage slave, living in the pod, eating the bugs, as the old cliche goes.
Yeah, they're not there yet, and it's being done very gradually. The propaganda that's normalizing, uh, you know, downward mobility as a norm is really quite extraordinary, right? The 20th century was something else, right? Like the faith in that science could work miracles, even that's fading. And the faith that, a political ideology, uh, presupposes a kind of a philosophical ground that um, the ground itself is neutral, and whatever you plug into it can reprogram it, right? It doesn't have agency of its own. So a lot of these ideas are dead. They don't matter anymore. Um, People might claim they do, but not really. People deep down inside don't believe them. And so the ability to propagandize a downward mobility, economically speaking, is something that really is has been carried out incredibly well. Normalizing living in like a commune where like your room is, well, you don't get a room, you share a room with all these other bunk beds, but at least you're still living in New York. Some of that is kind of working on the
Yeah, you can
surface
go to the
level.
bodega. Well, how do us
Yeah,
country
yeah.
people live without it?
Oh God, I still remember that was such a great meme. My life is like a film. Anyhow, um, some of it is working. Yes, right. Mostly, it's there to stop from the bad news flooding out. But we are seeing major change. You're seeing an exodus of white people from major cities moving out, moving to predominantly white areas in the country. Even a latest statistic that I saw of Californians who are moving to Texas. Um, the liberal threat is real, but what they've discovered is over half of them are actually conservative. You know, the type that would have voted for Trump. So, a lot of them are getting out. It's a question of buying time. I'm not because no, we don't say that this present system is tenable for the next 100 years. It may not even be tenable for the next 10 or 15. So people, obviously understand that to buy time, you have to get out of these places. And so, anyways, the lockdown, all of this, what it did, it was a great transference of wealth, the greatest transference of wealth in American history. Uh, People are leaving these houses partly for several reasons. Some of them have lost their jobs and they can't get them back, and BlackRock is making a deal that they can't refuse because it's $40,000 more than they would otherwise get, and they can sell it yesterday. That's you know for them that's good enough. They get out. Even the suburbs aren't that safe. That at least that's the projection that they won't be in 10 years, or as I said, economically, it's difficult. So people, the value of the dollar is inflating. Food prices are up. So people are making these decisions
And don't
after
get
this,
started on gas prices.
right? And gas prices, right? They've gone up, and so a lot of people don't really have a choice. Some of them could probably avoid selling their house, but as you said, no one is positive that the future will be a good one. And I think they're preparing for a bad future. Even if that means greater consolidation of wealth and power to fewer hands.
Oh yes, I would definitely agree. And it, despite the build back better rhetoric, and that's more on the open political side with elected officials such as Biden and Harris, the people who are really pulling the strings, the real power players in this country, know that things are going to be bad and know that, again, the American empire is on a decline and that. And funny enough, like I said, they come to this conclusion realizing that people like Michael Flynn, love him or hate him, were right about the geostrategic position of America in the 21st century, especially post Iraq War, and with a lot of these geopolitical blunders that you're going to have to cut a lot of fat off the empire in order for it to survive. And I think they came to this conclusion too late. And now they're trying to scramble to do that while
Yeah.
simultaneously trying to maintain a hegemonic position around the world again. You see Biden play this real oscillation routine where he'll be conciliatory towards the Russians while being aggressive towards the Chinese, or vice versa. Where he started out his presidency being very conciliatory before the Chinese, and especially before he even assumed office, and talking tough on the Russians. It seems like he's reversed course then. I don't imagine that will be the last we see of it. He'll probably give it 6 months. He'll be doing the same thing, trying to court the Chinese, demonize the Russians, and at least the pattern I'm seeing here is he's going to oscillate between the two. That seems to be the seeing which one will break down and side with us first. Now, I don't think either is going to happen, but I think that is the hope from the Biden administration, particularly Blinken in charge of his foreign policy there. But with that being said, I suppose we can move on to the G7 summit and the
Yeah.
impending U.S. Russian summit between Biden and Putin. So, the G7 was hosted in the UK this year, and Boris Johnson, the far right extremist, I need to pull up the exact quote he said, but the big theme of the G7 summit this year was being green, being clean, and really just helping out the world. So, really going on that theme, of course, Biden is a big player into that. He tried to hold that international climate summit via the teleconference, and you saw that worked out. So, Boris Johnson, as part of one of his initial speeches to the G7 leaders, said, quote, "We are building back better together, and building back greener, and building back fair, and building back more equal, and in a more gender neutral and more feminine way." How about that? Yeah, how about that? I don't understand how you can be both more gender neutral and feminine. And I mean, this was the guy who was the far right extremist, according to the BBC, in the wake of Brexit and the vote therein. And now that he's prime minister, he's indistinguishable from any other liberal elite. Now, that's not really a surprise. Again, I've never particularly been a fan of Boris Johnson. I never disliked him, but as time goes on, I am starting to dislike him. And again, it's somebody who's supposed to be like a British Trump down to the appearance. All of a sudden, what you get out of this is a quote like that. And again, the big focus is about equality, and it's sort of and the way they're trying to portray this, the liberal order, especially the Biden administration, is it's a return to normal. Look, it's just like when Obama was president. We're all going to meet up and talk about how we can do all these things, the issues in the world. To use a cliche term, a meeting of limousine liberals pretending like they care about all these poor and impoverished nations while sitting and having their multi-million, if not multi-billion-dollar summit, eating their exorbitantly expensive dinners that probably cost more than I make in a year and that what you make in a year, while talking about how we have to care about the economic and environmental conditions in sub-Saharan Africa, or some nonsense like that. And that's really the tone they tried to strike. Biden looked senile as ever with this. There's some very entertaining clips of particularly him with his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, of course we must respect her title, running around and corralling him, making sure he doesn't run off and say, again, blurt out a bunch of state secrets, if you will. And that has been very entertaining. Then there was footage from Macron and Biden just talking to each other where it is funny because Biden is a pretty tall man. I think he's like 6 feet even, and Macron
Or at
is
least, yeah.
yeah, Macron is shorter than that. I think Macron is like 5'6", 5'7". But you have Macron just like talking to Biden, just like body language, like he is completely in the dominant position, pretty much showing Biden like I am in charge, which is funny because when you compare the body language of whenever Trump and Macron would meet with each other, it would just be Trump yanking him around by the arm, and
Yeah.
it's a night and day dynamic watching Macron negotiate with both of them and conduct diplomacy with both of them. And honestly, I can only imagine the man is salivating at his mouth, realizing that hey, this is the competition, this is my time to shine. And again, I think the man's ambition, love him or hate him, grows exponentially every day, and I can only imagine this G7 summit, when compared to lame duck Merkel, Boris gender neutral Johnson, senile Biden, and whoever the hell the prime minister of Italy is now. I know Japan also got a new prime minister. again, the most respectable figure there, ironically enough, was Macron, and the French were the ones who looked like the most serious player in that entire summit. Now the summit is not over. I believe it has another day or two to go. But point being, and again, we'll round that out as time goes on. We may make an additional episode in the week. But point being is, I think France is really going to come out on top of the summit, and it's also night and day compared to particularly the 2018 G7, where the big question was the readmission of Russia with Trump showing up late to speeches like half an hour. I think Trump showed up half an hour late to the speech on what was it, gender equality or something like that, but and that infamous photo op where it's him and Merkel having this like showdown while the room is literally split between the two, with like
Yeah,
with
that was
Abe and
the Skittles of them.
yeah, with Abe and Conte on and Bolton all standing behind Trump, and Macron and I think Theresa May at the time, because it was 2018, and a few other people standing behind Merkel. It just looked like, like I said, the room was literally split between them. And it's probably one of my favorite images from the Trump presidency. Trump is sitting down with his arms folded, and Merkel's just like looking like she's trying to scold him. But again, it's night and day from that with the cheesy photo ops you're getting out of this G7. It has the veneer, it has the aesthetics of, oh yeah, we're back to normal. This is just like when Obama was in office, when Bush was in office. But you can fundamentally tell that this is like an artificial recreation of that.
Yes, and there are also other rumblings of a more grave sort concerning the EU. Biden, and it's interesting how the U.S. mainstream media has not covered it, and that is Biden's, forthright speaking towards Boris Johnson on the issue of Northern Ireland. One of the things, during Brexit was the avoidance of building a hard border between North and South Ireland. And this was mostly done, of course, because it would probably inflame, um, violence. And so it was understood that, Northern Ireland could remain part of the single market of the EU. And so Biden is kind of pushing this issue, um, looking at the inherent weakness of it, and at the same time, he's telling Boris Johnson, what you've got to do is you've got to comply with EU standards for agriculture, which is a big deal because it's such a wide subject matter. And some people have theorized that this is sort of the first step into derailing Brexit. Now, I mean, there's some respected voices out there that I listen to. As you know, I'm a bit of a pessimist. I'll believe it when I see it. I don't know even if he wanted to do that, and it could be that he does, but I don't think that's enough. Yes, this is going to cause animosity. Biden, no matter how many things he does similarly to Trump, and he's kept many of the same policies. We've already covered that concerning the border, migration, immigration, China, and Russia, and so on. However, when it comes to something like the JPCOA or Brexit, I think that's one of those things that Biden definitely wishes never happened. He does say that my presidency is the continuation of the Obama presidency to finish what got started. Now, are they going to succeed? At the moment, it seems doubtful, primarily because the British political class, the Tories, their popularity at the moment entirely rests on delivering Brexit. If they should forfeit this, as a party, they're finished. They'll be more finished than the Labour Party.
Yes,
And
and
that's one of the.
you have to remember Boris Johnson's entire December 2019 campaign, and you go back to the debates. No matter what issue got brought up, it was Brexit means Brexit. I believe, that was his outright campaign
Yeah.
slogan right there. And he really did a number on Farage's Brexit party, on the remnant of UKIP, on all these other parties that again, really ran on these issues. And then, of course, labor, which has issues, and of course, Jeremy Corbyn facing all sorts of backlash, both in my opinion, justified and unjustified. Again, regarding some of the controversies about him, a weak leader going to the election, who I still think would have been a funny prime minister of the UK, just for the just for the shits and giggles, so to speak. But with that being said, the Conservative Party and the local elections that they won rests on the fact that they're going to get us out of the European Union. And I think even despite the shrieking of a lot of these still pro EU Brits, that a lot of people have accepted this reality and this has to be done. We've started this process, and if we don't see it through, it will have even worse consequences than being out of the European Union. I think even some people who are more on the other side have started to come to that conclusion. But again, and that's also dealing with a European Union, especially now that's reorienting itself in various different directions, that really a United Kingdom membership would be more of a hindrance on them, more of an anchor around their neck than a benefit. And I think this goes particularly into Macron's approach, him trying to become the kingpin of this organization of the European Union, so to speak, where he has his plans with Russia, he has his plans with China. Now, again, not saying he's on good terms with either of them, but he has an idea of how to confront them. For example, he wants to more so bring Russia into the fold, but wants it to capitulate on several issues. Has no problem with these trade deals with China. You see France and Germany and the European Union as a whole making these trade deals with China. A lot of these things, as the British, who would have traditionally been the American eyes and ears within the European Union, would have stifled, if not outright prevented. I pose this question to any of you. Do you think, for example, this China trade deal that got signed at the end of last year between the European Union and China, do you think that would have went through with a British membership? Probably, but would have been much more of an uphill battle? Absolutely. And it's funny because you're even seeing this on a cross ideological level, cross partisan level, where you have neoliberals like Merkel and Macron wanting more diplomacy with China, and it was some Chinese diplomat that came, some low-ranking Chinese diplomat the other day that came out and said that Orban is the bridge between East and West, and he's helping to prevent a Cold War between the European Union and China, which I thought was an interesting statement, all things considered, with all of that. Like, again, really just bolstering Orban's international prestige as a prime minister of a country as small and relatively insignificant in terms of the grand scheme of things as Hungary, getting that kind of praise. But with that being,
Yeah, I
go,
mean, Biden does have some, one issue in his arsenal that can bend Britain, and that is the trade deal. He's already hinted that the trade deal might not go through unless the issue with Northern Ireland is resolved, unless Britain obeys EU regulations for agriculture. So he is applying pressure there. But with you, I would concur that Macron would. I mean, I think it was also good that you pointed out that maybe there was less of a likelihood that this trade deal with China would have gone through had Britain still been in Brexit. And that's interesting because now that Brexit is essentially done, in many ways, Germany and France don't want Britain to come back in. I don't say that's true for all the other countries, but there are factions that would rather not have Britain come back in because it would mean a more onerous relationship with America. And try as they might, they are trying to carve out a third way between America and China right now. Whether they succeed or not, I don't know. And the G7 is not as relevant today as it was 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. Primarily because the second wealthiest country in the world, that's nearly a parity of America, wasn't there. So again, I would look at this event as a kind of way of bolstering rhetoric around unity in order to combat China and Russia. That's its main purpose, is to get the message, particularly for the populations of these countries, that this is how it's going to go. It could get rough. but you'll have to be prepared for it. And this includes, all the court cases where these oil companies are losing, um, and are having to comply with uh, emission standards. BP lost. I believe Exxon lost. Um, but in the States, there are cities and states who are now suing them using basically the platform that was used in the 90s, that you didn't properly advertise how harmful this was to global warming, uh, and we're suing you for it. Now, it's amazing that all these people, and all these institutions and corporations are all on the same page. Because the oil companies, if they're unhappy with this, you're not finding out. So I think this too is part of this strategy to contain, particularly Russia, to lower the amount of emissions, is a way to lower the amount of fossil fuels used, to essentially power the society. Uh, yeah, and ultimately, this is going to mean a very difficult decade ahead to stay on top.
Yeah, that's all on top of, again, getting into the green imperialism, which I would say particularly targets Russia when you get into Nord Stream 2, especially. And regardless of what you believe about what we call climate change, whether it's man made or not, whatever, point being is, it is more or less indisputable. Now, I do dispute the rate, and I do dispute the alarmism around it, that the climate of the Earth and several places on Earth are changing. Things are getting warmer generally. And people have been saying for quite a few years now that Russia stands to benefit a great deal from this, as more of their colder, more frozen over land with permafrost tends to thaw out. That creates much more fertile soil. It also creates a much more navigable northern sea, which you compare the trade routes from East Asia into Europe, mostly passing through the Suez Canal, which remember that the Suez Canal had a little bit of a slowdown a few months back, if you've forgotten about that already, which I think plenty of us probably had. I did until somebody brought it up. You compare the length of route, whether that be from India, whether that be from China, whatever, these big trading hubs in East Asia, going through, again, the Red Sea into the Suez Canal, into the Mediterranean, into Europe proper, all these ports. You compare that by going northward with Russian ships taking off from, for example, Vladivostok, or Chinese ships going above Russia, in the North Sea, as things tend to thaw, as it's more navigable in the summer, even without icebreakers or less degree of icebreakers, it's a much shorter route. I believe, in terms of actual navigation time, it's about a 10-day shorter trip. Since I
Yeah,
think
it's about a third less.
yeah, I think the statistic was it takes 31 days to go again through the Indian Ocean and Suez Canal, whereas it would take 20 days to go through the North Sea. And again, that just shows the rate of efficiency. And a lot of the climate change rhetoric, I think, in recent years has been paranoia about what Russia stands to gain, because when it comes to the natural resources they will have access to, the natural resources they can exploit, the amount of farmland, and again, Russia's already a pretty big agrarian power. They're not necessarily an exporter, but they're a self sufficient country. But this would allow them to become an exporter, especially if their predictions about farmland and other parts of the world tend to come true, as droughts and famines would be a result of that, and desertification, whatever. If that can happen up north, funny enough, Canada also stands to benefit a great deal from this. So I wonder if the southern United States, or if parts of the United States are especially affected, how that may affect U.S. Canadian relations in the future. Again, depending on how accurate these speculations are, I don't have the maps on me. I'll have to get them next time. Of the speculations of agricultural products, I believe rice and wheat were the main two, showing which patches of land would be more fertile and less fertile. It had a world map, and most of Europe, even parts of southern Europe, where you'd expect it to be warmer, either maintained about would either gain or lose 5% of, again, how much they could yield, or gained more than 5%, which is how they had the scale. And Russia, especially, Northern Europe, especially, Germany, etc., a lot of these places had a lot to gain. So, quote unquote, climate change, again, we're taking the literal term, the change of the climate, the change of the temperature of the Earth on average, and change of weather conditions in parts of the Earth. Actually, what I believe, I would say from, I don't know, maybe 2015 onwards, and I think they're being more overt about it now, has been a primarily geopolitical struggle. Now, I don't think this is anything new. I think it was more covert for them, but I think they realized that, wow, changing in climate conditions could really affect the hegemony of the current liberal empire of the United States and of the current world order. So we need to move literally, heaven and earth in order
Yeah.
to keep the climate where it is so it can geopolitically benefit the United States rather than letting both natural and man-made cycles that have already been set into motion take place and cope with them as they come along. Now, again, I do think just as a personal side, there are plenty of ways where humans do abuse the environment and could be more environmentally conscious. Again, more common sense things rather than sort of this the nonsense the green movement has been since the 70s or 80s, again, completely politicized. But I think, quote unquote, common sense environmentalism does definitely have a place, just before anyone jumps down my throat about anything. But point being is, the current rhetoric now you see, especially coming from the United States, is climate change is bad in particular because it threatens our global hegemony, and we're going to invest in science fiction in order to stop that. That's really what it seems like is coming out of Washington, out of Brussels, out of London, out of Paris, etc. over the past 5 years.
Right, and Russia has gained the primary grain exporter in the world, including wheat, in the last few years. I mean, I always think that there's some embellishment going on. That isn't to say that overall we will probably see something like this in the next 20 years, and they are planning for that. Uh, but should this model be correct, countries like India and China will, I mean, to say nothing of, let's say, Africa, particularly Northern Africa and the Middle East, just, to say nothing of them, countries like India and China will be very adversely affected. So, and, but, ironically, you don't really see China doing anything uh, that would indicate that they're concerned about climate change. Um, because if they were, of course, desertification would occur rapidly. They do have the Gobi Desert. That would increase in size. Western China is quite arid, uh, and they don't really have as much arable land as you would need for a population of 1.4 billion. So, um, but I suppose that there's definitely a truth to this. They are preparing for it. I would also say that even if it weren't true, uh, I mean, it's a zero-sum game that they're playing with Russia right now, right? There is only a winner and a loser at the end of this road. And, the G7, I think, behind closed doors is going to make that quite clear. And so going for a Green New Deal is actually a way of lowering dependency on Russian gas. Now, again, there's a lot of things that don't make sense. Why did America break its record from last year to this year by buying the greatest amount of reserves of Russian oil? Uh, I mean, I can't explain all of it, but I would say that the general trend is to stop using fossil fuels because it's not a strategy that geopolitically helps America at the moment. But
Yeah, some like,
that
for
isn't
example,
really
the early 2000s where it would have been much more advantageous and we were on much better terms with Russia, where we didn't care if they made a few bucks off of the European markets when it came to energy. But yeah, I think you have a general point, and there are a few discrepancies, which I do think if you want to really stretch it, say, bolster it, showing that, well, maybe the U.S. is so paranoid or so concerned about this potential increase in power of Russia, that they're trying to get what they can out of them, they're trying to extract the resources while also putting on a show of force against them, etc. But again, there's endless speculation you could have about the
Mhm.
U.S. Russian energy trade, but what you're saying are really good points. I do think the big push towards a Green New Deal and the 2030 climate change, all that sort of stuff,
I
is
mean, maybe it's short term.
yes. And I'll be curious, especially going into the German elections and after the German elections, which were about 2, 3 months out from now. I believe those are at the end of September. So yeah, about I think actually 3.5 months, where the Green Party stands to gain much, and also if the American regime can really play up the green imperialism, saying trying to stop Nord Stream 2 via environmentalism, that will be something to keep your eye on. But I'm curious over the next 5, 10 years, over the next decade or so, how the rhetoric of environmentalism continues. Will it be one of those social movements that had a lot of prominence in the late 2010s and early 2020s that just faded into irrelevance like they had with many other sorts of social issues whenever they serve their purpose? Or is it going to be something that they're going to, again, put their eggs all in one basket and really just place their bets on this and hoping this will be the key, this will be the thing that reasserts American liberal
It,
hegemony?
it's incredibly short-sighted because, first of all, the infrastructure to carry this out is not being built, nor has the money that would be necessary to build it has been allocated. It's not nearly sufficient enough. The other problem is you would have to really demote people's expectations in a far bigger way than just eat the bugs. That's kind of a notoriety right now, and these notorieties come and go. Sometimes they can define a whole decade, but they come and go. So you have to ask yourself, if the West really reduced their emissions by 30%, how many more electric cars would you need? How much more copper would you need? What would you do with the wasted batteries? Do you even have enough manufacturing capacity to make that happen? So like how serious is this? Or that's what I'm looking out for. Is it really going to go through? Is it really going to happen? And is it really even going to be effective? Um, honestly, like you're going to need generating stations. Like this is you're still going to need gas, and you still haven't sold people why not owning anything and including a car, and probably not even renting a car is okay and you'll be happy. It seems at the moment very, very far-fetched and a very short-sighted tactic to curb uh, Russia's influence, let's say, on the energy security um, concern of Europe.
Yes, and assuming this is all genuine and not rhetoric, which I'm sure plenty of it is rhetoric, they're not presenting the solutions to continue on with this. Like, I'm sure they would like to. I'm sure these petty tyrants, if you will, would like to micromanage every aspect of society like that. But even though they want to, even though they have the will to, I don't think they have the means to, or else I think they would be already. I think
Yeah.
they would have implemented all this stuff if they could, but they realize that this is such a pipe dream, and even with again technological advances in the next decade, will likely continue to be a pipe dream. And really, again, I do think a big motivator behind this, as I've been saying, has been to curtail Russian influence, and of course just break down the current state of society, the last holdouts of resistance to them in Western society. But with all that being said, I do think all these questions, especially with the G7 being so focused on environmentalism, lead perfectly into the Biden Putin summit, where they're really trying
Mhm.
to diffuse tensions after this whole debacle with Belarus and with Ukraine and with, of course, the long-standing issue of Crimea. And you even have Ukrainian energy companies saying out, well, the completion of Nord Stream 2 could mean outright war with us, of course. The Ukrainian, not even the Ukrainian state saying that, a Ukrainian energy company saying that. Yeah, big talk. I'll believe it when I see it. But point being is, you have all these things leading up to a Putin Biden summit. And really, I made this point about Trump, and I'll continue to make this point again. What you're seeing right now is this desperate scramble to make this sweetheart deal they should have made with Russia probably 20 years ago. Probably between the span of 2000 and 2004, Bush's first term, or 2001 to 2005, Bush's first term, to bring Russia more or less into the Western fold. At least tell them they're going to be an equal partner. Now, you're probably not going to fully respect them, but at least give them enough breathing room. For example, Georgia and Ukraine don't meddle in there, and really just leave at least the former Soviet Union unmolested and more or less under Russian influence. Now, of course, barring probably things like the Baltic states who had already joined NATO at that point. But point being is, leave Russia to its healthy sphere of influence in exchange for helping the West, helping the United States curtail, at least at that time, number one, Islamic terrorism, number two, a rising China. Now, again, if they would have had the foresight to make that deal between 2001 to 2005, or pretty much any point before the Georgia War, if they would have had the foresight to make that deal, that would have been the time to do it. And it seems like Trump or his foreign policy team at least realized, maybe we should be reaching out to Russia. Maybe we should be pulling maybe we should do to Russia what Nixon did to China in the 70s. And of course,
Mm.
Trump got lambasted for that. You had the Russia investigation. You had the complete derailing of the Trump presidency, for that matter, to the point where we got where we are today. And then Biden comes in calling Putin a killer and a thug, saying we must stand up to him. All of a sudden, wants to meet up with Putin and make the same sweetheart deal. Are they meeting in Helsinki again? Is Finland the neutral third
No, no,
country?
no. They're meeting in Geneva, Switzerland.
Okay, I couldn't remember
And
what.
there's some interesting facts about this. Now, one of the things I was afraid, now that you bring up Helsinki, is that would there be a press conference? The last one was a complete shambles. It was, essentially Trump. Are you still working with Putin to undermine America? I mean, I exaggerate, but that was essentially the whole point of the question.
Yeah, and that was the
And-
thing. Like, do you believe that Russia still meddled in the election? Trump's like, no, he told me they didn't. And then like the whole thing was like, oh, so you believe Russian intelligence now? That sounds like something a Russian agent would say. Again, just sort of the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
way the
yeah.
media had treated Trump for several years at that point. But do go on.
Right. So there isn't going to be a press conference now. I believe NBC has secured an interview with Putin, but that's all I've heard. Other than that, this is going to be a showdown. I don't know what kind of clips are going to come out of this. I don't even. I can understand in Trump's administration how there were probably some people strategizing, thinking, look, we gotta, China's the bigger enemy. We got to get Russia on our side. But the truth of the matter is, all of that is done. Russia has far more interest in common
It's
with China
over.
than it does. Hmm?
It's over.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, what are they going to woo them with? As one Russian analyst put it, why, you do not you do not open your sail to sail toward a setting sun, but a rising sun. And, make of that what you will. So the perception is that siding with America is not the future. Europe is in a kind of is stagnant economically speaking, and the real player is China right now, and that's where the better investments are. But then there's all sorts of other geopolitical reasons why Russia would want its eastern half fairly secure, because Russia has 12 time zones, and it's very difficult to guard this massive country, the largest country in the world. Um, that is one of the reasons why Russia could not maintain its power, was because pulling China away forced Russia to accommodate these unpatrolled areas with 400,000 troops, and it ultimately was very costly. And then when you compound that with Afghanistan, it drained it.
as well
It
as
completely
troops
drained.
in the Eastern Bloc, and
Right,
especially
right.
under the Reagan administration, where in '83, where everyone thought we were on the brink of a nuclear war, where at any point you could have to mobilize troops to fight in Europe. So again, having them surrounded on those three fronts: Central Asia, East Asia, Europe.
Yeah. So no, it doesn't. It makes no sense at all. I think what'll happen is, I mean, part of this is just making the rounds for Biden. He has to appear uh, like a president. So this is something that's expected. I don't think Russians really care whether Putin meets with Biden or not. But in America, it's quite different. And Biden has talked tough, and he said he's going to talk tough with Putin, as if this is really going to do anything. America's very well aware of the red lines, and America's not going to concede Europe to Russia. So this is a zero-sum game, right? Like nothing's going to come out of this, in my opinion. Nothing is going to happen. Uh, it's funny that you bring up Ukraine with claiming that all-out war is going to happen if Nord Stream 2 goes ahead. Well, today was the first run of Nord Stream 2, the first test run to see if that gas is flowing, and I'm going to presume it is. But this leads me to an interesting event that happened between Biden and Zelensky. They had a phone conversation. Zelensky did an interview with Axios media, and he was very upset. He thought America had let down Ukraine, but that he still had hope in Biden, much like Michael Jordan when the chips were down. Like he literally used Michael Jordan as an example. But what's even more hilarious is the next day he said that not to worry, Biden has a track for quick accession into NATO. When the White House, now the White House said nothing, either confirming or denying that. But when it published the phone conversations, there was no mention of that. So what was said? Well, Biden said, you're going to have to do something about the corruption in your country, which ultimately means you're paying out. The oligarchs in your country are doing extremely well. We would like our oligarchs to do very well. Instead, we would like our oligarchs to move in. Thank you very much. That's all it is. And so the corruption thing is going to go on until like there literally is no sovereignty in for the Ukrainians. And so, of course, the White House denied that it ever made those claims. It was a rather short phone call based on the transcript. And so what Zelensky was trying to do was kind of politely strong arm Biden into saying something or committing to something in order to advance, his interests for Ukraine. And of course, Biden isn't going to do that, right? Um, you could argue that America is playing a much longer game, whatever the costs might be to Ukraine. Maybe it's a bad strategy, but it's not the strategy that Zelensky or the Ukrainians want. So, I mean, that's the long and the short of it. So that's why I bring it up because it's hilarious to see a gas company claiming that there's going to be a war right after their president has already been disproven. So
Yes, and really, I think you put it in better terms than I can. And again, this whole meeting, at least for the American, at least for the Western side, is all about optics. Again, the Russians, and just judging on the ones I've spoken to and judging on what their media class says now, a media class, of course, is a very good insight to what the ruling regime thinks because they're practically one and the same. That it doesn't matter who's U.S. president, things are going to more or less continue on the same track while conditions remain the same. So I don't really care if Putin meets with Biden or not. Now, again, we'll see. We'll see how that plays out as time goes on. But really, there's nothing to be gained from this meeting except a photo op, and I think that's what most people are expecting anyway. And really, again, unless it completely blows up and unless it causes a diplomatic fallout, like that's probably the only other outcome than just nothing happens than just it was a handshake and nothing more. And they talked for a bit. They didn't have a press conference, etc., etc. But with all that
Yeah.
being said,
I
I
mean,
go on, go on.
no, I was just going to say, I think all their they want to wash their hands of this whole thing, right?
Yes,
They're going to leave and say, we tried, we even, we even kind of gave them an Nord Stream 2, but they're not going to comply. It just furthers the narrative, right? Like it was Germany who asked Russia to construct this pipeline, not the other way around. So whatever. Where were the Americans when the first Nord Stream 2 got was being propositioned? Like it's just nothing. Like I say, I'm very, very, very doubtful anything is going to come of this, and it'll be just to say that you can't reason with them.
yes, of course. It is going to be one of those things where it's like, we'll thrown up their hands. We tried to talk to the Russians, but you just can't negotiate with evil or barbarians or whatever term they're going to throw out there. While again, not that hypocrisy is much of an argument. They'll travel to places like Saudi Arabia and various countries in Africa that whose people are under brutal conditions. But that's all aside the point. Now, speaking of the Middle East, we just have a bit of news about Syria here, just to close out some Middle Eastern news. So, activity has increased in northwestern Syria. The Russians have really been pushing forward, and of course, Syrian forces where they've been striking a lot of these groups in again northwestern Syria, pushing back against these quote unquote opposition forces, the last of the whatever they call themselves, HTS, Al Sham, various
Yeah,
groups, not to mention the Turkish groups, a lot of infighting there. Relatively quiet on the Kurdish front with very little happening within the SDF occupied zones. Now, there are concerns of oil shortages to both Syria and Lebanon. Now, Lebanon, the situation is a bit more dire. I believe the estimates were they only have 9 days of gasoline left due to current energy conditions there. Now, we'll see what I would imagine, particularly Iran, would do about that situation, and especially when it comes to Syria, Russia. But you have ISIS resurgences in central Syria near Hama, and of course, pro government and pro Russian strikes coming to attack those. So, relatively calm week in Syria. It looks like as time goes on, they push further and further into Idlib. And of course, as we get a large advance on Idlib, lo and behold, there are Israeli strikes on Syrian positions, which actually did quite a bit of damage. These strikes weren't. It wasn't the
yeah,
usual deal where most of their missiles get intercepted and they do a bit of damage. Maybe they hit a warehouse that was more or less empty and kill a few soldiers. These ones did some pretty significant damage. I think they got about a dozen Syrian
7 dead.
soldiers killed or wounded, and
Yeah,
yeah, that's actually a pretty high strike. I guess Bennett's incoming or Netanyahu's outgoing government is sending a message and setting expectations for Bennett for what you better do in Syria. And again, you have that left-wing center coalition with the hard right party in Israel that is set to come in sometime over the next week or so. So unless Netanyahu can pull a sweetheart deal out of his ass, I think that's what we're looking at here. Which
yeah.
somebody pointed out that it's actually a funny parallel between that and between what Jobbik wants to do in Hungary with an alliance with the left wing and centrist parties to remove Orban, where they could put in power but have to negotiate with the left wing parties. And again, it's just aside the point, very strange diplomatic dealings there. But again, you had some pretty aggressive Israeli strikes, something we haven't seen, I would say, since April 2018, and the lead up and following the U.S. strikes on Syria under Trump. So again, I think as intensity increases in Idlib, you'll see Israel, and again, we'll have to see how Bennett's government is about the Syria situation. I imagine probably just as, if not more, belligerent than Netanyahu's government strikes on Syrian forces advanced towards Idlib. Now, I think one of the big questions moving forward into Syria is love them or hate them both. Putin was able to negotiate very well with Netanyahu. Now, he didn't get Israel to completely cease their operations in Syria, but he got them to curtail them to a degree where this strike, after however long, looks like something out of the ordinary, because it is. Now, I'm curious. Putin is a very skilled diplomat. He's very skilled at diplomacy and dealing with foreign leaders, regardless of whether he's on good terms with them or not. I'm curious what Putin and Bennett's relationship will be like. Will he be able to
Mhm.
negotiate the same sort of deals that they've had between Syria and Israel, or Russia and Israel regarding Syria, that Putin and Netanyahu do? Will Bennett keep those? Will he renege on those? Is his campaign to go more hardline than Netanyahu? I think that will be a very, very key factor, very interesting key factor going forward on the Syria issue. Is how well under this new government, new incoming government, will the Israelis negotiate with the Russians? And I have a feeling it could be worse than Netanyahu's government. I have a feeling that it
Yeah.
could be more belligerent, and that I do think, especially when the good graces of the U.S. really picking up the slack in Syria, will ingratiate, for example, Bennett to Biden and who's Bennett's second command, the leader of the Liberal Party. I can't remember, his name escapes me. It's something very very Israeli Jewish, but again, because Bennett is just more of a just run of the mill standard name there. But again, I just have a feeling, and maybe realistic constraints will stop this from happening because of just the situation on the ground. Maybe they won't be able to do it. That we will see under this new government an increased Israeli activity in Syria, whether that be strikes, whether that be aid to these groups via the Golan Heights, etc.
I kind of, I, I kind of suspect that we're already seeing that it's going to be worse. My gut feeling is, based on the success of the reemergence of ISIS in central Syria, just this week alone, uh, within 1 week, about 23 fighters were killed. Three of those were Tiger forces to date, and 13 injured. Uh, there was a Russian officer, a Russian serviceman who was killed in northern Syria from a landmine. Russia has retaliated, but it's not enough. It's been about 13 months that we've seen a real serious resurgence. ISIS has to be receiving funds all over again. So I don't know which country it is. The Arab states, the Gulf states might be making overtures, very positive overtures to Syria, but I'm skeptical, and there's a very strong likelihood that America has found a way, a loophole to fund ISIS. And another reason why I suspect that's the case is, PBS, I don't know if people caught it, had a special called The Jihadist. And, he got this Martin Smith of PBS got this interview with Mohammed al Jilani, who was the creator of the Al Qaeda branch in Syria, named Al Nusra, which later on became Tahrir al Sham. And so now he's not wearing the jihadist garb anymore. He's put on a suit, and he's telling the Americans they have nothing to fear. Uh, sure, like, we're a terrorist group, obviously, but we hate Assad. So he's the leader of the Salvation Government of Idlib, apparently. So, we said this about a week or two ago that MI6 had met with Al Jilani. And you could write something like that off and say, well, you better check your news sources. Um, you see all kinds of things on the internet, blah blah blah. Well, here it is. So this is a massive PR campaign to legitimize these terrorist cells that the U.S. has always relied on. The U.S. can never completely, jettison these people. They're integral. They might bomb them. They're frenemies. They might work with them. It doesn't matter. They are entrenched. And I would say that of any theater that's the weakest to hurt Russia, it is Syria. It is where they can up the escalation, and you play a zero-sum game and lose there. You lose a lot if you're Russia. You lose reputation. You could lose Latakia, because these groups are not interested in a peace deal. They're playing the long game. You're going to have to do some kind of all-out war. If you do, then Your theater in Europe could be affected. So it is a weak point.
Absolutely, and it's on the fringes as well. And it's also a direct military commitment, which, if involved any deeper, could again gain the resentment or the disillusionment of the Russian population because already it was initially it was very enthusiastic after the airliner got shot down, which carried several Russian civilians, and then of course they played on the religious and civilizational angles that they're defending the cradle of Christianity, so to speak, which admittedly they were defending a lot of the Christian population in Syria and a lot of the historic sites. But even as time goes on, they got more disillusioned. You had talks of a Russian withdrawal in late 2017, 2018, and on and off with Russian troops being decreased there, especially as ISIS tended to wane and go into the background. But as things increased, again, it might be a harder sell, maybe not an impossible sell, but a harder sell to convince Russia to continue its current level of commitment, if not increase its commitment in Syria. And I do think, depending on how things go in Russia, a lot of the burden of combating the new resurgence of ISIS and all these other groups in Syria will fall on the shoulders of Iran. Maybe it'll be Russia acting through Iran as a proxy, but we could see that being the direction they take. And of course, Iran is gotten a bit of breathing room under the Biden administration, but still under plenty of scrutiny. And we'll also have to see Bennett's administration's position towards the Iranian issue and how Israel deals with that. Now, while Bennett may be this hardliner, again, he is in the coalition with the centrist and these liberal parties, so we'll have to see how that works out. So the Israeli government might be just in complete gridlock when it comes to just this Frankenstein coalition it's being ruled by. But again, with that in Syria, I will maintain that we are in the last summer of Idlib. I will maintain that much, but I do think it's going to be far more of an uphill battle than it has been recently, especially with resurgences of ISIS in central Syria, which again can really only be explained by the fact that the likely fact that they've received a new sponsor. Now, whether that be the U.S. picking, maybe Biden finishing what Obama started. Maybe this is what he meant right here, but it could be that. It could be very well Turkey. I doubt it's Turkey, or one of these Gulf Arab states trying to curry favor with these groups in Syria, or it could be the situation it was early on where it's individual oligarchs and rich individuals within places like the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia that isn't necessarily state sponsored. Now, a lot of it was state sponsored, sending money to their favorite jihadist groups from their personal fortune. It could be a result of that, and it could be that they've gotten the green light to do that again from the CIA, from the State Department, from
Yeah,
whoever. But again,
yeah.
I don't think that
Well,
we'll see ISIS take over half of Syria again, but I do think it's going to be a major thorn in the side of the current efforts happening in Idlib in northwestern Syria currently.
right. And in a way, you're also bringing us to a point that there is no figure that they have in mind that's going to replace Assad and somehow unify the country. That figure does not exist. Any other figure would have even less ability than Assad. That's the truth of the matter. That's why you haven't seen anybody in 10 years. But another, interesting fact about this normalizing of Jelani is that the organization responsible for publicizing him was initiated by the International Crisis Group. This is a think tank based in Brussels, and they have close ties with Biden and NATO. So, of course, this is a concerted effort to normalize them. I guess in a way, claiming that January the 6th was worse than 9/11 kind of fits into this larger narrative, right? That we have to demonize white people and Russia simultaneously, absolve uh, Muslims and Arabs in order to facilitate this much larger picture that's unfolding.
Yes, I would definitely agree. And again, this has been a semi expected event to come in Syria with the rise of a Biden administration. It was expected that there would be more difficult in Syria, but I was expecting when Biden did issue those strikes that we would see a lot more. So all things considered, I would say this isn't that bad, but I doubt it's the end of it, especially with, again, these
Yeah,
resurgent ISIS
yeah,
attacks. I do think it'll be more of these guerrilla attacks, but just to put in perspective, we're not in the position where we were about this time last year, where it would be every week where a Syrian intelligence officer was being assassinated in eastern Syria. So we're not back to
yeah,
those levels yet. That's something to keep in mind. But I would
yeah.
say we're at risk of devolving to those levels very quickly, and that Syria could become very muddled again. I don't think again we're going to see Assad driven from Damascus or driven from power, or ISIS take over half of Syria, or any of these other possibilities that they were speculating about back in 2014, 2015. But man, this is going to be a thorn in the side of Assad in particular and Russian goals as a whole, from what I
Right.
see at
And
least.
yes, and so the Gulf states have funded this as well as Israeli lobbies. In fact, the Israeli lobbies are the ones that were successful in getting the U.S., the CIA, to supply weapons to Jelani and his little minions in Idlib. So yeah, I mean it's the same players, it's the same side. Israel, Arab states, America, basically advocating for Al Qaeda, which, by the way, was not as bad as January the 6th.
Oh, of course not. And maybe if those moderate Syrian rebels had been there to defend the capital, the day would have turned out much differently. But before I dig myself into a further hole or incriminate myself, I think this is a good place to call it an episode.
Yeah, yeah, I would say so.
So thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report. I hope you enjoy your weekend and tune in next time. And we'll see you then. And goodbye.
Take care.